Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone. This is part 2 of Everyday Anarchy, The Freedom of Now by Stefan Molyneux. Molyneux continues by saying, taxation, the foundation of any stated system, fall under the category of the initiation of the use of force. We can just imagine that if any other person or group of persons tried initiating taxes, we'd see this as fraudulent. If I were to say, here are a group of charity workers, philosophers, scientists, and theologians who have greatly contributed to the well-being of society, and entrepreneurs, I guess you could add. Since they have contributed so much to the well-being of society, they have the right to take 5% of your income annually, cage you for victimless crimes. If you don't give them money to fund schools your children have to attend by law, well, you should be put in a cage. I mean, it's just so obvious that it's theft when any other group does it. It's no coincidence that the group we think it's legitimate to have the right to rule happens to have compulsory education laws, and they pay the salaries of the teachers who educate the masses. They also have things like Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA infiltrates the media and controls the mind of the populace that way. Molyneux goes on to discuss tribal virtues. He says, referring to a story of when he was younger, I could not help but think, even when I was 6 or 7 years old, that should my paternal uncle leap across the table and strangle my maternal uncle, this would be viewed as an immoral behavior by everyone involved, and he would doubtless go to jail probably for the rest of his life. On the other hand, should they be placed in a costume and array across a battlefield according to the whims of other men in costume, such a murder would be hailed as noble sacrifice, and medals may be passed out, and pensions provided, and ticker tape parades possibly ensue. Thus, even in those long ago days of soft white tablecloths and gently clinking culture, I mentally chewed on the problem that murder equals evil, and also murder equals good. Murder equals jail, and murder equals medal. Of course, what he's referring to is if you're part of a tribe, let's say the Japanese tribe, the American tribe, the British tribe, the Nigerian tribe, of course, you see all the world as, well, those people better not murder us or commit atrocities. But when you do it, of course, when your group does it, your tribe, well, it's not really murder when the U.S. kills 100,000 people in a single day by dropping a nuke. It's not really, that's collateral damage, and that's terrible things that happen in a war. Now, if some other country were to bomb America, that's murder. They're terrorists. They should be fought till every single one of their co-conspirators have been wiped from the face of the earth. But, it's not kidnapping when the government puts you in a cage for not chipping in for the welfare state or the warfare state. But if someone takes $20 from you, make sure you call the police, they cuff them, they put them in jail, they go through all these things to learn how to live in society. Well, of course, here we have two double standards, one for our tribe, where morality has totally different standards, and that of the other. The whole issue here is people are not holding principles consistently. He goes on to make this excellent point about historians missing the central issue in issues of war and mass murder, and war being one of the great evil things and one of the most tragic things that people have to go through. The carnage of conflict is only an effect of the core violence which supports war, which is the military enslavement of domestic citizens through the draft. The World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, all these terrible bloody conflicts involved enslavement. And historians, of the ones that I come across, the major ones, not really interested in the fact that the states had the ability to enslave, forced labor, probably under the worst conditions. So much worse than being forced to pick cotton, it's not even comparable. They're not really interested in the fact that they're coercively funded so people can't opt out of them. That makes them more likely. But the historians supported by the state pretty much don't care. And even more importantly, the direct theft of their money, which pays for the war. If we recognize violence that is at the root of war, domestic violence, not foreign violence, then we stare at the core and ugly truth at the root of our society and most of our collective moral aspirations. The core and ugly truth at the root of our society is that we really, really like using violence to get things done. So long as the state does it, of course. In fact, it is more than a mere aesthetic or personal preference. We define the use of violence as morally necessary within our society. Molyneux goes on to discuss anarchy and protection. He says, there is a reinforcing myth that constantly exists in society. Governments exist to protect the citizenry. So when Wesley Clark, after 9/11, says, hey, I had a secret meeting in the Pentagon where I found a top secret document that says we're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years, and it comes to fruition. And there's something called, I think it was Presidential Security Directive 9, where there was a plan to invade Afghanistan on September 4th of 2001. I mean, people just say, oh, wow, look, government, thanks for keeping us safe, even when it's proven that these wars are planned in advance. That in 1998, the Project for a New American Century sent a letter to Bill Clinton saying, we really need to invade Iraq. These mass murdering sanctions and bombing campaigns just are not enough. As Ben Shapiro would call it, having a light footprint in the Middle East, but mostly isolationist until we were hit on 9/11. Of course, governments don't exist to protect the citizenry. They're there to violently dominate them and create the illusion that they're protecting them, educating them, regulating them from others harming them. When we examine the narrative that the state exists to protect its citizens, we can clearly see that if we unearth the basic reality of the violence of taxation, a malevolent contradiction emerges. It is very hard for me to tell you that I am only interested in protecting you if I attack you first. If I roll up to you in a black van, jam a hood over your head, throw you in the back of my van, tie you up, and toss you in my basement, would you reasonably accept as my explanation for the savagery that I only wish to keep you from harm? That is the war on drugs right there. You just saw it right there. I'm going to put you in a cage. I'm going to shoot you if you resist because bad things might happen to you. Externalities. Yeah, it's going to negatively affect the families, as Attorney General Bill Montgomery said with a straight face right to me at a city council meeting. It's really about the family, so you can't call it a victimless crime. Yet, you know what else affects the families? When a family member is put in a cage and taken away from them, they lose their dignity. They most likely will experience violence in prison. It hurts their job aspect from here on out, which gives the family less potential money, less likely to enjoy family time and get income from that person in the future. They're seen as an outcast. They don't get to see their friends yet. That also negatively affects families. Molyneux goes on to discuss euphemisms. Thus, it inevitably falls to anarchists to perform the unpleasant task of digging up the body in the backyard or pointing out the widespread, prevalent, and ever-increasing use of violence to achieve moral goals within society. Is this right? Asks the anarchist, fully aware of the hostile and resentful glances he receives from those around him. How can violence be both the greatest evil and the greatest good? It's totally evil when the average person uses it, according to status, but when the government uses it, it's necessary and it's virtuous, and without it, there'd be chaos. And the schools we need to be coercively funded, and the military needs to be coercively funded. If the violence that we use to achieve our supposedly moral ends is in fact justified and good, why is it that we are so ashamed to speak of it? As Murray and Rothbard says, war is mass murder, conscription is slavery, and taxation is robbery. We're obviously afraid to address it, or else people would say, yes, the state has the right to violently dominate you because, but instead they say, well, regulation is necessary in a society because, well, no, that's just a euphemism, of course. Or gun control is another one of these ridiculous euphemisms. He says, this is also a quote from Molyneux, there is no such thing as gun control. There is only centralizing gun ownership in the hands of a small political elite and their minions. It's the equivalent of, there's gun violence in the public, therefore the state should monopolize guns. Okay, There's violence in the U.S. government, therefore Russia should monopolize guns. Same logic, no principles at all. Molyneux goes on, he says, where there is no choice, there is no morality. This brings to mind a Hayek quote, coercion is evil precisely because it thus eliminates an individual as a thinking and valuing person and makes him a bare tool in the achievement of the ends of another. My body, my choice. Yeah, my money, my choice. Yeah, my business, my choice. My voluntary interaction, my choice. Status, exit, please and thank you. Molyneux goes on to say, using coercion to drive charity is like using kidnapping to create love. If we accept the Aristotelian view that the purpose of life is happiness, and we accept the Socratic view that virtue brings happiness, then when we deny choice to people, we deny them the capacity for virtue and thus for happiness. Brings to mind this meme. I'm a liberal because I am pro-choice, except for schools and guns and trade and healthcare and smoking and union membership and light bulbs and Walmart. And if you shop at Amazon, well, you should be violently dominated. And anytime you make an interaction with an employer, if it doesn't meet standards A, B, and C, both of you should be put in a cage. I mean, what kind of food can you eat? Obviously, it just never stops. Molyneux goes on to say, if violence is the only valid way to create economic equality, then surely it would make far more sense to simply allow those below a certain level of income to steal the difference from others. Yeah, if violence is totally justified, why do we need a state? Let's just do it ourselves, he says. If we understand that state welfare agencies skim an enormous amount of money off the top, they represent a truly savage expense, then we can easily eliminate this overhead and have a far more rational system besides simply by eliminating the middleman and allowing the poor to steal from the middle and upper class. Oh, yes, how easy. The state would just distribute little badges to people under certain levels of income, and that badge gives them the right to steal, and everyone just has to wear a badge based on a color representing where they are in the quintile of economic arrangements. And then, and then everyone from Haiti has the right to steal from everyone in America because Haitians are poor. There's no, bringing people up by free trade, voluntarism, entrepreneurship, building businesses. No, inequality exists, so we have to introduce state violence or else nothing can be achieved. Molyneux continues, indeed, the barriers to using force personally are far higher than voting for the use of force in a democratic system. If you have to pick up a gun and go and collect your just property from richer people, that is quite a high barrier to entry. If, on the other hand, you simply have to scribble on a ballot once every few years, then sit back and wait for your check to arrive, surely that will drive the escalation of violence in society far more rapidly. Yeah, that's why there's likely to be more violence if people don't have to do it directly. That's why voting is not just sort of, it's okay, it's your view, it's my view, whatever. The fact that people are withdrawn from seeing what they're actually engaged in through voting, it's very rare they get to see the Eric Garner type of violence. But that is every single law right there. A peaceful person allegedly selling Lucy's untaxed cigarettes. That is literally what the state has taken an oath to do every time you break a law. If you resist, then they get to kill you. I mean, these are the people supporting inequality. This group gets a monopoly on murdering you if you don't abide by their arbitrary rules. By the way, I believe in equality. Right. Molyneux continues, these things are genuine improvements, referring to things like slavery ending, cotton picking, whip slavery, saying women should be treated absolutely as equals, even if you believe in traditional gender roles. Women should stay home, cook, and have kids. Men should go out and work. There's nothing wrong with that so long as you don't believe in violently imposing it. He says, these things are genuine improvements, to be sure, and we should not ever fail to appreciate the progress that we make, but neither should we automatically and endlessly assume that every step forward is the final and most perfect step. and that nothing can ever conceivably be improved in the future. This is the fallacy of non-anticipation. The fallacy of non-anticipation consists of supposing that everything worth doing or saying has already been done or said. You commonly hear this, well, if that was such a good idea, why hasn't it been implemented yet across the planet? Well, people are irrational by every metric. Any new idea is rejected on the grounds that if it were any good, it would already be part of current wisdom. Proposals are rejected because they have not been anticipated. Molyneux goes on to discuss anarchism and reform. Many people will say, all right, would you stop complaining? Just get involved, elect the right people, and vote. And organize political rallies, you lazy moron. Well, that implies right there that it's extremely difficult to change this thing you see as virtuous, and we need it because it represents the people. Like, if I really don't like something a business or a charity is doing, do I have to dedicate my entire life to changing it, or can I just opt out? Well, we should have the same standards for the state. He says, free markets allow us to make decisions without consulting the majority. When we think of a truly free market, otherwise known as the free market, which here he means any social system based on voluntary exchanges and private property. It does not mean banks or bosses or business or monopoly man or money or dollar signs or usury. It just means voluntarism. We understand that if we do not have to work for years and years and give up thousands of hours and tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to satisfy our wishes, if I want to shop for vegetarian food, say, I do not have to spend years lobbying the local supermarket or joining some sort of somewhat inefficient advisory board and pounding lawn signs and writing letters and cajoling everyone in the neighborhood. All I have to do is go and buy some vegetarian food locally or over the internet if I prefer. Yes, more choice because of voluntarism and the free markets. The more free trade, the more choice, the better. The less people have to spend their entire frickin' lives begging people under mind control to get evil people to do the right thing. The justification for government, particularly a democratic government, is really founded upon the idea of a social contract. Because we happen to be born in a particular geographical location, we owe the government our allegiance, time, energy, and money for the rest of our lives, or as long as we stay. Now, if there were really a contract, well, yes, you pay us this money because we protect you. So that means if government doesn't protect you, so if I come up with an example of government not protecting me, then government's illegitimate, then government goes to jail. See, if it's a contract and there's two sides and I don't pay and I go to jail, when you don't hold up your end of the argument, what happens? Well, their budgets increase. When government fails, they get more money and more power because they say, see what happened? We listen to the isolationists, we listen to the laissez-faire free marketeers, and look at this bad thing that happened, even though it's them the entire time, whether it's the result of blowback, whether it's their direct violence, whether it's a false flag, whether it's the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates arbitrarily, creating malinvestment, and an economic recession. No matter what, government gets more power after every single atrocity. So it so obviously is not a contract. And just because you believe in general obligations, you benefit from, for example, I've benefited greatly from all the millions of people who have lived in America and done great things, and people all over the world. However, it does not follow that those people have the right to violently dominate me. I greatly appreciate it, and I try to give back as much as I can through free videos, free things on archive.org. I have a Scribd account where I give everything away for free. So yeah, I appreciate it. But just because I benefit from all the stuff built around me by all the entrepreneurs, thank you so much for creating a beautiful place for me to live in. However, it doesn't justify you taxing me and violently dominating me, caging me for victimless crimes, etc. So the social contract is a non sequitur. Molyneux he continues discussing the social contract. And Molyneux continues, contract and consent. Children cannot enter contracts because they don't have the mental capacity to consent, just as someone in a coma, someone severely drunk, someone mentally retarded. And adults cannot enter contracts against their will. Again, back to the principle of consent. voluntarism, self-ownership, recognizing value within every single person. It is important also to remember that there is fundamentally no such thing as the state. When you write a check to pay your taxes, it is made out of an abstract quasi-corporate entity, but is cashed and spent by real-life human beings. Thus, the reality of the social contract is that it rotates between and among newly elected political leaders, as well as permanent civil servants, appointed judges, and the odd consultant or two. The coalescing kaleidoscope of people who cash your check and spend your money is really who you have your social contract with. He says, well, this can occur in the free market of, I take a loan out from Group X and 10 years later I'm still paying Group X even though all those people are different. The difference is I've voluntarily taken the money based on agreed upon terms. If we examine the concept of the social contract, which is claimed as a core justification for the existence of government, it is more than reasonable to ask whether the social contract would justly enforce the social contract itself. In other words, if government is morally justified because of the ethical validity of an implicit and unilaterally imposed contract, will the government defend implicit and unilaterally imposed contracts? If I start up a car dealership and automatically sell a car to everyone in a 10-block radius, and then send them the bill for the car they have bought, then send them the car as well, and bind their children for eternity in such a deal as well, would the government enforce such a contract, or would they recognize it as extortion? I mean, then everyone, no one ever goes out of business. Blockbuster can just keep sending us bills so long as they let me rent a movie every month or so. It's absolutely ridiculous. Again, if anyone besides the state used that lack of moral justification for a contract, we'd see it as ridiculous. Molyneux continues, any moralist who said that getting rid of slavery would be criminal and moral disaster of the first order, but instead encouraged slaves to attempt to work within the system, or counseled slave owners to voluntarily take on the goal of treating their slaves with less brutality, could scarcely be called a moralist, at least by modern standards. Instead, we would term such a reformer as a very handy apologist for the existing brutality of the system. By pretending that evils inherent in slavery could be mitigated or eliminated through voluntary internal reform, these moralists actually showed or stalled the progress toward abolition in many areas. By holding out the false hope that an evil institution could be turned to goodness, these sophists blunted the power of the argument from morality, which is that slavery is an inherent evil and thus cannot be reformed. So this is actually just much more of a practical argument that Molyneux gets into. He says, well, in principle, can you change the mafia by infiltrating the mafia? Can you infiltrate, he uses the example, a Jane Austen book club and turn them against Jane Austen? Well, at some point, you have to use, when the group is so big, they steal trillions of dollars annually, and they constantly have all these meetings and all these big megaphones, and they've infiltrated the media. I mean, at some point, it's so hard not to act within the state. But this is a point he makes at the end of the book. He says, the state very often grows because of concentrated benefits and dispersed cost. For example, farmers fight very hard to get their $1.2 billion in subsidies, as they did in 2005. How hard is the average citizen going to fight to stop farm subsidies from being taken? Well, not at all, because it costs each of us like 35 cents or something ridiculous. Or the military-industrial complex. It might cost us each like, $1,000 or something, but dedicating our entire lives to saving $1,000, well, it just doesn't fit the cost-benefit analysis, so very rarely do people do it. Molyneux then asks the larger question, why have you never heard these criticisms? When you have a 24-hour media cycle who's constantly trying to get people in and weigh different ideas and find the truth and do nothing but engage in deliberative democracy where we can have a better world for us and our kids, well, how have you not heard the most obvious thing ever? Let's hold this group, the state, to the same moral standards we hold anyone else to. How has that not been heard? He says, well, first of all, academia is violently funded by the state, so will teachers or students ever bring this up? The teachers have an incentive. I'm not going to bash my employer. The students either never learn it or say, wow, if I learn this, I'll be extremely unpopular. So you have a self-correcting system of people not bringing to surface the reality of the state. Imagine, if the Koch brothers ran a school system or Coca-Cola ran a school system, you ever think there'd be, here's why the Koch brothers are totally illegitimate. Here's all the evil they've done in the world. Or here is how bad Coca-Cola is for your teeth, brought to you by the Coca-Cola company. Well, of course not. The state is just another group acting in its self-interest. The problem is we don't hold them to the same standards we otherwise would if they were a voluntary organization, not seen with any extra rights. This is a great meme. Government, the most dangerous religion in the world, with its sacred symbols, known as the flag or the Constitution, giving it its inherent legitimacy. No more different than the cross or a Bible in principle. Actually, it's worse, because people don't think that being a Christian gives you any extra rights. Common prayer. You have to fund the school. Your kids have to attend it by law, or else you're in opposition to truancy laws, unless your name's Greta Thunberg, of course. And you have to pledge your allegiance to a flag. They have temples such as the White House. They have human sacrifice where people are seen as virtuous. That man died fighting for his country, fighting for something he believed in. Well, doesn't that apply to every terrorist who blow themselves up? How about every kamikaze pilot risked their life for what they believe in? That's nothing more than human sacrifice. And it's never, well, this person died because this operation, the benefits outweighed the cost and it was morally justified. People just blindly say, they joined Group X, known as the military. Oh, they're automatically risking their lives. I know for a fact they're working in the best interest of the common good. Mystic rituals such as campaign slogans or voting, and there was constant worship of the state, people thinking that government is the mechanism through which society progresses. Molyneux says, thus, when the anarchist begins talking about his theories, he will face either passive or aggressively hostile. He will face either passive or aggressive hostility from those around him, who will view him as an irritating and counterproductive time waster. Whether or not his theories are true is besides the fact. He discusses the principle of we have sort of two institutional choices. We have voluntarily funded competition to achieve something like, let's say, climate change is real, or there's inequality. We can have any voluntarily funded competing set of ideas or organizations, or we can have a coercively funded monopoly. The problem is everything you think could happen. Oh, well, yeah, if there's competition in a court system, what happens if a police organization or a court gets corrupt? Haha, just poked a hole in your theory. Well, yeah, that could definitely happen. But is that not able to happen when there's the existence of a state? Do governments not get corrupt? I mean, everything you say about a possible competitor applies 50-fold to a monopoly, because the most evil people are attracted like a bat signal to violently dominating over other people without having to compete for their reputation. Molyneux says, before I started this section, I said I would present an interesting paradox, which is that the degree to which anarchism remains undiscussed is exactly the degree to which anarchism will undoubtedly work. Anarchism is fundamentally predicated on the basic reality that violence is not required to organize society. Violence in the form of self-defense is acceptable, of course, but the initiation of the use of force is not only morally evil, but counterproductive form of pragmatic standpoint as well. Anarchism, at least as I approach it, is not a form of relentless pacifism which rejects any coercive response to violence. My formulation of an anarchist society is one which has perfectly powerful and capable mechanisms for dealing with violent crime, in the absence of a centralized group of criminals called the state. In fact, an anarchist society will undoubtedly deal with the problems of violent crime in a far more proactive and beneficial manner than our existing systems, which in fact do far more to provoke violence and criminality than they do to reduce or oppose it. Molyneux continues, anarchists recognize the power of implicit and voluntary social contract and the power of both positive incentives such as pay and career success, as well as negative incentives such as social disapproval, economic exclusion, and outright ostracism. Thus, both academia and the state itself work on anarchistic principles, which is the spontaneous self-organization and enforcement of unwritten rules without relying on violence. A truly stateless society, where such rules could be made explicit and openly contractual, would function even more effectively. So why do people believe such nonsense, such as the state? Well, 17% of professors in the social sciences are outright Marxists, and those are the ones who admit it. You have also things like the Frankfurt School and just the state monopolizing government education that's compulsory in general. He says that's one of the many reasons why people don't see reality for what it is or don't recognize the nature of the state. Furthermore, since economists all believe that free trade improves quality and productivity, they could, as a group, measure the quality and productivity of the economics profession before and after the introduction of free trade and voluntarism. This would be an enormously valuable body of research and would empirically support the case for going through the challenges of undoing protectionism within a profession. So, for example, because so many believe in free trade, what they should do is engage in more voluntarism. They should work less for the state and voluntarily make more videos. They could compete in much more of a market. If free trade is good and monopolies are bad, doesn't the same thing apply to courts? Doesn't the same thing apply to police and military and enforcement of contracts, etc.? Molyneux continues, saying, when a new idea attempts to enter the intellectual bloodstream of society, so to speak, those who have placed their bets on the continuance of the existing belief structure react as any biological defense system would, with a combination of attack and isolation. In a similar way, when a new idea infects the existing ecosystem of social thinking, intellectuals will first attempt to ignore it, but then will attempt to kill it off using a wide variety of emotionally manipulative tricks such as scorn, eye-rolling, cynical laughter, aggression, insults, condensation, ad hominem attacks, and so on. This is what Ayn Rand referred to as the argument from intimidation. We can see, what does the term traitor mean? The founders were by definition traitors by every metric. It was not some foreign government. The British government was the government at the time. Were they traitors? I mean, what does the term traitor mean besides going against the cult? Bradley Manning exposes murderers and people defend the murderers. Like high-level intellectual people functioning in this society defend the murderers and say he's bad for exposing them. He goes to jail for exposing them. The murderers get, pardons and medals and parades and thank you for your service. And you see him in the airport and you just jump out of your chair like a mind-controlled slave and start clapping, saying thanks for keeping us safe, even when you have no clue what they're up to. Or how about Hugh Thompson? This is the guy who blew the whistle on the My Lai massacre, who got the most hate of all. Now, of course, the murderers at My Lai, no, of course. Thank you for your service. Thank you for risking your life, everyone else. Hugh Thompson, don't you tell us what really goes on there. I love being in a religious cult just thinking, virtuous actions are taking place overseas. Molyneux continues, of course the reason that society does progress at all is because all thinking men and women pay at least a surface lip service to the principles of reason and evidence, saying that the internet to some degree diminishes the threat of isolation because you can get many more opinions. When you have many more opinions, the right opinion increases in the likelihood it will enter the mainstream. So that is one of the great benefits of cars too as well. When cars were introduced, more people could go more places and exchange more ideas. The bad ideas are already out there surfacing. It gives the good ideas a competing chance. Socrates having been killed, of course, for corrupting the young, which, is not much different from today when how we see Hugh Thompsons and Bradley Mannings and Edward Snowdens treated. Once we begin to cross-examine our own core beliefs, the prejudices that we have inherited from history, we will inevitably face the feigned indifference, open hostility, and condescending scorn from those around us, particularly those who claim to have an expertise in the matters we explore. This can all be pitiful and bewildering, it is true. On the other hand, however, once we develop a truly deep, intimate relationship with the truth and thus reality, and thus really with our own selves, we will find ourselves almost involuntarily, looking back upon our prior relationships and truly seeing for the first time the shallowness and evasions that characterized our interactions. We can never be closer to others than when we are ourselves, and we can never be closer to ourselves than we are to the truth. The truth leads us to personal authenticity. Authenticity leads us to intimacy, which is our greatest joy in human relations. The truth will set you free. Thank you for watching Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone. This was a book summary of Everyday Anarchy, The Freedom of Now by Stefan Molyneux.